This week, the government announced a new refugee and asylum seeker policy where primarily single-channel crossing male asylum seekers will be sent 4,500 miles away to Rwanda for offshore processing as part of a new deal to help tackle the Channel migrant crisis. The scheme is targeting single men, as they apparently make up the majority of the 28,300 people who crossed the Channel last year. Those sent to Rwanda will be encouraged to settle there instead of in the UK, whilst their applications are being processed. The scheme has been denounced by opposition parties and rights groups as immoral, unworkable, with detractors arguing that Britain should not be contracting out border control to poorer foreign nations. However, defenders argue that it's a necessary step for a sovereign nation to protect its borders and also to disrupt the cruel criminal gangs that benefit from people smuggling. Therefore, in this week's edition of Moral Dilemmas, we discuss the morality of border control. I'm joined in the studio by Henry Bolton, OBE, International Security and Border Expert and former UKIP leader, and also still with me, Alistair Donald, co-convener of the Battle of Ideas charity and Living Freedom. So I'm going to start with you, Henry. I mean, how is it right? So is everything that we can do something that we should do? So just because this may deter people or just because we can strike this deal with Rwanda, does it make it right?
No, it doesn't make it right. And it's not going to solve the overall problem either. It may work to an extent, and I'm sure it's going to be tested in the courts. The moment this starts to happen, the moment the first people try to go over there, or in fact, can you imagine trying to get people who we're sending supposedly to Rwanda on a plane and they say, I'm not going. So where's your sort of recourse to legal force or lawful force to force them onto that aircraft to take them over? There are all sorts of things that are going to be obstacles and challenges along this route. And I suspect it's not going to work in the final analysis, either legally or operationally. But
do you support this policy in principle?
Sorry?
In principle, do you support it?
I think let's inevitably it's going to be tested by the courts. Let's see if the courts let it go. If so, then indeed, fine.
Because your contention seems to me that you don't think it will work. But in principle, from a moral perspective, do you think that it is right and proper and justified to contract out our immigration policy to other countries?
I think, well, it's a more complex answer or question than that. But let's look at who these people are, first of all. All right, we're not talking about people who are fleeing France. Let's go back to that original thing. Now, we could discuss that or not, but people are not coming across the Channel because they fear for their lives in France. The point is that most of these people are economic migrants. By the time they cross the Channel, now they may have left Syria or Afghanistan or something for another reason. So if they're economic migrants, then they're going to have to look carefully as to what they want to do. And we should not be granting asylum.
You say they're economic migrants, Henry, but we know that actually the majority of them, even upon appeal, do get accepted, so are regarded as legitimate refugees.
But that's not because legally they are, but the Home Office is trying to address that because the burden of proof on proving or demonstrating that this person is going to be subject to persecution or whatever in the country that they've come from originally is so vague that actually there is very little opportunity for anybody in government or the civil service or anybody in the immigration service to actually say, or the courts, to say it will not happen, because the burden of proof is just about, there is no definition of it. So that's got to be addressed. And so when you're granting somebody asylum just on the assumption that there might possibly, because they say so, even though they haven't got identity papers or anything else, just because they say they may
there's usually quite a lengthy process. I mean, a lot of the time it's often 2-3 years that these people are waiting. But Alice, I'll just bring in you. I mean, what's your reaction?
Well, the two words you used in your introduction were unworkable and immoral. And I think it sounds to me reasonably unworkable, this solution that they've arrived at for all sorts of reasons, some of which Henry has mentioned. The immoral, I think, doesn't just, used by its critics, doesn't just refer to the specific Rwanda situation, but what they see as the immorality of border controls. And I think that's a bigger issue. I think the idea of the open borders, which we tried to overcome through leaving the European Union because we wanted to take more control over our borders, that still resonates for some very influential people in society, and they try to keep that going. And so essentially what they object to is the very idea of controlling borders. And I think as as a nation state, sovereign nation state, we should be in control of our borders, and we should take the requisite solutions required to be able to control them.
But can you think that it is right or for a mature sovereign nation to control one's borders, and also think that this particular policy is an immoral one?
I think you can think it's ill-advised and immoral. I mean, I thought, for example, when the European Union struck its deal with Turkey 5-6 years ago to keep all the refugees from Syria out, I thought that was a reasonably immoral solution, because it talked up openness on the one hand and then denied people the right to come within the European on the other. It set up Fortress Europe, as it were. So I think that the particular solutions can be immoral, but I think that the objection is not to, by many people, is not to the particular solution, but to the very principle of having borders around a nation state.
And Henry, I mean, what is the underlying principle that governs our immigration policy? Is it that we should want people that contribute to society, or is it that we want people to integrate, or is it just a purely numbers thing, as was suggested under David Cameron, just getting it below tens of thousands? I mean, what do you think the underlying logic should be? Because it doesn't seem to be coherent.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. There is no overarching set of strategic objectives across government as to what we're trying to achieve with our borders, and that is a major failing. What we've got is an immigration policy, we've got a trade policy, we've got a fisheries policy. All of these impact on borders and are impacted by borders. But there is no overarching set of common objectives that all these agencies and government departments are working towards. So that's a major failing. So what should it be? What we should be doing is providing the economic and security, health and welfare of the people who live and reside in these islands. That's the primary objective. And borders provide us with an opportunity to focus efforts on a jurisdictional line, if you like, to be able to do that. Now, then we come into what's fair and what's unfair. And if you look at what we're talking about now and what we've been dealing with on the Channel, somebody can come across on a dinghy with no paperwork whatsoever. We can't actually, in most cases, demonstrate even what their place of origin is. We could discuss that, but I could give you chapter and verse examples of that. But we look at, I know a particular case which I've been discussing with people involved, 2 Ukrainian refugees, two teenage girls who've been brought over by an English woman, or they were taken to Poland. The UK denied them a refugee visa, on the basis that their parents themselves hadn't signed the documentation, although there was documentation from the parents requesting this visa. It was just bureaucracy gone mad, and they've gone back to a war zone as a result.
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that at a political level, there does seem to be a desire amongst some of the government, at least, to do something about controlling borders. At an operational level, in terms of border force and the agencies that are there to provide or implement the solutions, and to the civil service and all the apparatus to support that, there seems to be an inability or an unwillingness, actually, to implement some of these situations. So we had the situation at the end of last year where the retiring Director General of Border Force had a pop at the whole idea of, isn't it terrible that we have to enforce these border controls? There seems to be a lack of seriousness amongst the agencies charged with implementing these things. It's ironic that we're having this discussion just now in the weeks following the situation where we decided that we wanted to bring a whole load of Ukrainian people that are fleeing the country because of the war into Britain, and yet the agencies charged with doing that, and the Home Office as well, were unable to put in place a set of logistical solutions to provide for that. In fact, they frustrated them.
I think this comes back to Anaya's point in the first place.
Yeah.
If there was a real strategic direction and vision and set of strategic national objectives and an overarching strategic framework, border strategy, I've helped 14 countries to write them. Even Albania has such a thing. We don't in this country. And if we had such a thing, it would frame all of this and bring some clarity, which then would place the civil service and others in the right position. They'd be able to orientate themselves towards a consistent set of objectives that don't exist at the moment.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Henry Bolton, OBE, international security and border expert and former UKIP leader. And we'll come back to Alistair throughout the show.